an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the Prime Minister had hoped to sign off his plans for a renegotiation of Britain's EU membership later this month, but it seems his fellow leaders have decided not to give him an early Christmas present. And that means the referendum on whatever deal he does get will also be delayed. Well, the timetable... Last month, David Cameron sent a letter to Donald Tusk, President of the European Council, setting out the UK's EU reform demands. There were 4 main areas which he wants renegotiated: protection for non-Euro countries and safeguarding their rights, exemption from an ever closer union and more powers for national parliaments, restoring competitiveness in the EU, which involves cutting red tape and concluding free trade agreements with other global economies. And finally, the one that's causing the most headaches, restricting benefits for EU migrants. Under the Prime Minister's plans, EU migrants would not be able to claim any in-work benefits for 4 years. On Thursday, David Cameron abandoned hopes for a referendum as early as May next year, after admitting he would not be able to get the deal he wants at an EU summit in 2 weeks' time. Donald Tusk will on Monday publish an assessment of the British demands in a letter to the 27 other member states. It follows a round of confessionals in which governments have outlined their concerns. He said December's meeting will pave the way for a deal in February. By then, David Cameron will be forced to decide whether to campaign for a Brexit or to stay in the EU. Well, the timetable may have slipped, but the Work and Pensions Secretary and committed Eurosceptic Ian Duncan-Smith has been speaking on the Andrew Marr Show this morning, and he said the delay was a sign of strength, not weakness.
Well, the mood is actually very upbeat and very good. I think I'm involved in putting together the package that the Prime Minister wants to take to the Council. So we've been deep in discussion about that. The Prime Minister has been pretty clear throughout that he wants to take a package that supports the manifesto commitment. So in my area, for example, on welfare, he's very clear that he wants to have that commitment to people living here and contributing to the system, and that will be one of the key elements of the negotiation.
Well, that was Ian Duncan-Smith. We did ask for a government minister to talk to us about the Prime Minister's renegotiation plans, but were told none was available. But worry not, we can speak instead to the Conservative MP Bernard Jenkin. He's the Vice President of the Eurosceptic Conservatives for Britain group, and he joins us from our Westminster studio. Welcome to the programme, Bernard Jenkin. Are you as upbeat and optimistic as Ian Duncan-Smith?
No. And it's ironic, really, because Ian and I were elected on the same day in 1992, and we both opposed the Maastricht Treaty. We both despair about the direction the European Union has taken. And while Ian is gamely supporting the Prime Minister's negotiation in its own terms, I think he knows in his heart that this is a very lame renegotiation compared to what the Prime Minister was originally promising. I mean, there are a whole range of things that the Prime Minister wanted, like getting out of all the home affairs and justice provisions of the Lisbon Treaty, like getting a complete opt-out of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is, for example, gives the power to the European Court of Justice to decide prisoner voting, not just the European Court of Human Rights.
But
and so it goes on.
You know Ian Duncan-Smith well, as you've just outlined. He's not known as a raging Europhile. And if he is optimistic and confident, certainly publicly, in the Prime Minister's chances of a meaningful deal over Europe, then why can't you be?
Well, because Ian is bound by collective responsibility as a member of the Cabinet. I am not. I am free to speak my mind. If you look carefully at what Ian said, it was very narrowly focused on, in a rather circular way, on his own, on the Prime Minister's own terms of reference. The European Union has changed so dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. The question that British people are going to have to face: do they want to carry on with this journey? There's no status quo, by the way. Do they want to carry on with this journey of integration? Because what the Prime Minister is negotiating about will not change the course of the European Union or the course of the United Kingdom within the European Union. They are relatively trivial, rather complicated, but relatively trivial negotiating demands.
But he's going to get the deal by February, so he will have something...
he gets the deal by February. It won't change the price of fish. It won't allow the United Kingdom Parliament to determine our own laws. It won't restrict the European Court of Justice, which is another of the Prime Minister's demands that he's now dropped.
Right.
It won't restore the opt-out of the social chapter, which was gained by John Major in the Maastricht Treaty.
But it
won't achieve any of these things.
But Bernard, there were never going to be concessions, or enough concessions, that would satisfy you.
I'm glad you're saying that. I'm glad you're making the point that this renegotiation was never really going to address the fundamental problems.
Or you were never going to be satisfied by it.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that.
Or you were never going to be satisfied by whatever the Prime Minister managed to secure.
The Prime Minister was making these much tougher demands. He has dropped these demands. I would be supporting the Prime Minister's negotiating position if he'd stuck to those demands.
Right, which one particular? I mean, if there was one thing that you would like to see him secure and bring back that you could sell to both yourself and your constituents, what would it be?
Well, the fundamental one is to restrict the ability of the European Court of Justice to rule on almost anything. I mean, I mentioned prisoner voting, which is now moved into that area. And the whole question of the relationship between those countries that don't want to be in political union, don't want to be in monetary union, don't want to be in the fiscal union treaty that's being redesigned by the core Eurozone states. The problem is, what we've got to face is, this is not a status quo we're voting to stay in. It's a continuing development of European Union integration.
Well,
and if you want to have choices, you have to vote leave.
Right, well, and in that vein, I mean, it's reported that the Prime Minister will campaign for Brexit if his demands aren't met. You laugh. Would you welcome David Cameron leaving, or rather leading, I should say, the campaign for the outs?
We would very much welcome David Cameron joining the Vote Leave campaign. That's absolutely clear about that. But I don't think it's very likely. I think at the moment he's trying to convince people that he's being really tough. But we all know that this is what happens in all EU negotiations. The government pretends to be very tough, it pretends to be a great showdown, and then in the end, hey presto, the rabbits come out of the hat and everything's absolutely marvellous, and it's game, set and match to the British.
Stay with us. I mean, Jenan Ganesh, is there anything you think that Ian Duncan-Smith will be able to sell once this renegotiation is done and dusted?
Sell to his own backbench
and to him.
Eurosceptics. I doubt it. I think, as Bernard Jenkins suggested, in January 2013, when David Cameron talked about renegotiation, he meant something pretty sweeping. And it even, in addition to the things that Bernard Jenkins mentioned, it even included flirting with the idea of some deep reform to European free movement. That was what was being suggested 2 years ago. There's not going to be anything approaching any of that in any deal that emerges early next year. I think a substantial number of Tory backbenchers will find that hard to support. And the tactic from Downing Street to leak the idea that David Cameron might conceivably support the Leave campaign, I thought was slightly misjudged, because it's so transparently obvious that he won't. And if anything, it was a message sent to other European capitals. If you don't give me this deal, then I might join the other side. Britain might end up leaving. Which
is what he was advised to do, but much earlier on in this renegotiation, was you had to threaten out, otherwise no one will take you seriously.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with Janan that nobody will take seriously the idea that David Cameron might campaign for out, because fundamentally that is not what he believes. He wants to stay in, and actually has said so from the beginning. And I think, Bernard is right. There is a feeling that the renegotiation will only achieve something rather cosmetic, but then Cameron will pull a rabbit out of the hat and pretend he's got some great, enormous concession. It's all been terribly tough. I don't think people will be convinced by that.
So I leave it to Nick to stick up for the Prime Minister in this particular instance. I mean, what would the rabbit in the hat, or the rabbit coming out of the hat, be, do you think, for David Cameron once this deal is done and dusted in February?
Well, it'll be an absolute tremendous rabbit, because we'll know about it. Because he can't go beyond what he wrote in the letter to Donald Tusk. And the rabbit he will take out of the hat and says, isn't this amazing, is an opt-out for the UK from the EU's historic commitment to ever closer union. And he will say, that's really significant, and you know what, it will have an impact on European Court of Judgment rulings. But the point is, A, we know that's what he wants to achieve, and B, people like Bernard, we see Bernard is nodding, Bernard will say, no, that really is just a cosmetic change. That is not going to change the fundamental primacy of EU law over UK law. That's what Bernard is concerned about, and that is what Ian Duncan-Smith is concerned about.
If there were to be a concession on in-work benefits, which many people feel is impossible, bearing in mind the EU rules, Bernard Jenkins, would that satisfy you?
Well, no, because in the end, the European Court of Justice will always have the power to overturn whatever has been agreed. The problem that Prime Minister's got, he started right at the beginning with grabbing some quite big things, but while refusing to argue with the overall architecture of the European Union. And bear in mind, if you don't change the architecture, nothing really changes, except that the European Union will carry on morphing into a state.
All right.
And we'll be part of that state, whether we're in the euro, whether we're out the euro, whether ever closer union is in the treaty or not in the treaty or whatever.
On that note, Bernard Jenkins,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Now